When we think of the First World War, our minds often conjure images of the muddy trenches of the Western Front. We picture the desolate, shell-cratered landscapes of Flanders and France. Yet, another brutal and often overlooked conflict was being waged in a vastly different, but equally unforgiving environment. This was the Italian front, a battleground set amongst the breathtaking but treacherous peaks of the Alps. Here, the Kingdom of Italy clashed with the forces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in a struggle that became known as the White War. The name was tragically fitting, referring not only to the perpetual snow and ice that defined the landscape, but also to the pale face of death that was a constant companion to the soldiers fighting there. Italy had entered the war in 1915, hoping to gain territories from its old rival, Austria-Hungary. This decision opened a new front that stretched for hundreds of kilometers from the Swiss border to the Adriatic Sea. The fighting was concentrated in the Dolomite and Julian Alps, where soldiers had to contend not just with enemy bullets and shells, but with the mountains themselves. The war here was vertical. Men fought for control of strategic peaks, ridges and passes, often at altitudes exceeding 3,000 meters. The strategic objectives were simple in theory, but incredibly difficult in practice. Secure the high ground to gain an advantage over the enemy below. This led to a series of grueling battles, like the 12 battles of the Isonzo, which were fought with immense ferocity and staggering loss of life. The soldiers fighting in this theater were a special breed. Italy deployed its elite mountain troops, the Alpini, who were recruited from the local Alpine communities and were skilled climbers and skiers. Their Austro-Hungarian counterparts were the Kaiserschützen. These men were uniquely equipped to handle the extreme conditions, yet even their expertise was pushed to the absolute limit. They had to build fortifications directly into the rock, carving out tunnels, trenches and barracks from the mountainside. Supply lines were a constant nightmare, with food, ammunition and equipment having to be hauled up sheer cliffs by hand or using complex systems of cableways, often under enemy fire. The war in the Alps was a testament to human endurance, engineering and sheer desperation. The nature of the combat was intimate and terrifying. Small groups of soldiers would launch surprise attacks, scaling vertical rock faces at night to surprise an enemy outpost. Miners from both sides tunneled deep beneath enemy positions, planting massive explosive charges to literally blow the tops off mountains. The sound of explosions would echo through the valleys, triggering avalanches that could bury entire companies in seconds. Unlike the vast impersonal slaughter of the Western Front, the fight for a single peak could be a personal hand-to-hand struggle. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood, and the mountains became a silent, frozen graveyard for tens of thousands of men who battled not only each other, but the very forces of nature. The enemy on the Italian front was not just the soldier in the opposing trench. It was the mountain itself. The environment was an active and deadly participant in the conflict, claiming lives with an indifference that was perhaps more terrifying than enemy aggression. The weather in the high Alps was extreme and unpredictable. Temperatures would plummet to well below minus 30 degrees Celsius, causing severe frostbite that could lead to amputation. Soldiers' uniforms, designed for more temperate climates, offered little protection against the biting winds and deep cold. Men froze to death in their sleep, their bodies discovered perfectly preserved in the ice months or even years later. The cold made every piece of metal, from a rifle barrel to a mess tin, a potential source of injury, sticking to exposed skin. Snow was a relentless adversary. It fell in immense quantities, burying trenches, blocking supply routes, and isolating entire units for weeks at a time. The constant snowfall created the ever-present danger of avalanches, which became a terrifying weapon of war. Both sides learned to trigger them deliberately, firing artillery shells into heavy snowpacks above enemy positions. A single avalanche could sweep away hundreds of men in an instant, burying them under tons of snow and ice with no hope of rescue. It is estimated that more soldiers on the Italian front died from avalanches, frostbite, and other weather-related causes than from direct combat. This White Death was a silent killer that stalked the high peaks throughout the winter months. The terrain itself was a formidable obstacle. The fighting took place on steep, rocky slopes and knife-edge ridges, where a single misstep could mean a fatal fall. Soldiers had to be skilled climbers just to move around the battlefield. They secured themselves with ropes while fighting and constructed precarious wooden walkways along cliff faces to connect their positions. Getting supplies to these high-altitude outposts was a monumental challenge. Everything, from a loaf of bread to a heavy artillery piece, had to be laboriously carried up the mountains by men or mules, or transported on rudimentary cable cars that were prime targets for enemy gunners. The physical and psychological toll of living and fighting in such a perilous environment was immense. Life in the mountain fortifications was a grim existence. Soldiers lived in caves and tunnels, bored into the rock and ice, often in cramped, damp and unsanitary conditions. These ice cities offered protection from shelling but were breeding grounds for disease. The psychological strain was enormous. The isolation, the constant cold, the ever-present danger of falling or being buried alive, and the sheer, overwhelming scale of the mountains created a unique kind of mental anguish. The soldiers of the White War were engaged in a battle on the very edge of human endurance, fighting a war against both a determined enemy and a hostile, unforgiving landscape that held them in its icy grip. By the beginning of 1918, the war had reached a critical turning point. On the Eastern Front, Russia had collapsed into revolution and signed a peace treaty, freeing up vast numbers of experienced German and Austro-Hungarian troops. For the German High Command, this presented a fleeting window of opportunity. They knew that the United States had entered the war in 1917, and hundreds of thousands of fresh American soldiers would soon be arriving in Europe. It was a race against time. Germany had to strike a decisive blow and win the war on the Western Front before the full might of American industry and manpower could be brought to bear against them. This desperate situation gave birth to one of the most ambitious and dramatic offensives of the entire war. This final, all-or-nothing push was known as the Kaiserschlacht, or the Emperor's Battle, more commonly referred to as the German Spring Offensive. Beginning on March 21, 1918, it was a massive assault designed to shatter the Allied lines and force a negotiated peace on Germany's terms. The Germans unleashed a new and terrifying tactic. Instead of a prolonged artillery bombardment followed by a mass infantry charge, they used a short, incredibly intense hurricane bombardment of high explosives and poison gas. This was immediately followed by specially trained, lightly equipped stormtroopers who bypassed strong points and pushed deep into the Allied rear, sowing chaos and disrupting communications. The initial results were spectacular. The Allied lines, which had barely moved for years, suddenly broke. The British Fifth Army was virtually destroyed, and the Germans surged forward, advancing further in a few days than they had in the previous 3 years. For a moment it seemed as though Germany might actually win the war. They pushed towards the crucial city of Amiens, a vital railway hub, and even brought Paris within range of their new long-range supergun, the Paris gun. Panic began to set in among the Allied leadership. The offensive was a brutal shock, demonstrating Germany's remaining military power and tactical innovation. It was a moment of supreme crisis that forced the Allies to unify their command structure under the French general Ferdinand Foch to better coordinate their defense. However, the German offensive, for all its initial success, contained the seeds of its own destruction. The stormtroopers, while effective, outran their supply lines. The soldiers were exhausted after years of war and deprivation caused by the Allied naval blockade. When they overran Allied supply depots, they often stopped to loot food and drink, which they had not seen in years, slowing the momentum of the advance. Furthermore, Germany had thrown its best and most experienced troops into the attack. When they suffered heavy casualties, there were no replacements of the same quality. The offensive eventually ran out of steam, grinding to a halt just short of its strategic objectives. Germany had shot its last bolt, and its army was left exhausted, overstretched, and vulnerable. The failure of the German Spring Offensive marked the beginning of the end. Germany had exhausted its finest troops and its last reserves of morale and material. The Allied forces, on the other hand, were growing stronger every day. The initial shock of the German assault had been absorbed, and vast numbers of fresh, well-equipped American soldiers were now pouring into France, ready for battle. The strategic initiative had decisively shifted. Under the unified command of General Foch, the Allies prepared to launch a counterattack that would ultimately bring the war to a close. They had weathered the storm and were now ready to unleash one of their own, combining new tactics with overwhelming industrial and numerical superiority. The Allied counter-offensive began on August 8, 1918, with the Battle of Amiens. This attack was a stunning success, employing a coordinated assault of infantry, tanks and aircraft that completely surprised and overwhelmed the German defenders. The German general Erich Ludendorff famously described August 8th as the Black Day of the German army. It was not just a military defeat, it was a catastrophic blow to German morale. Entire units began to surrender without much of a fight, a sight unseen on the Western Front for years. This victory at Amiens was the opening act of what would become known as the 100 Days Offensive, a relentless, rolling series of Allied attacks that would systematically push the German army back across all the territory it had gained. Unlike the static trench warfare that had characterized most of the war, the 100 Days Offensive was a war of movement. The Allies had learned the lessons of the past 4 years. They employed combined arms tactics, where infantry, artillery, tanks and aircraft worked in close cooperation to break through enemy lines and exploit the gaps. The use of hundreds of tanks was particularly decisive, allowing the Allies to cross trenches and smash through machine gun nests that had previously held up attacks for weeks. From Amiens, the Allies launched a series of powerful blows all along the front, forcing the Germans into a fighting retreat. They were pushed back towards the formidable Hindenburg Line, the defensive system they believed to be impenetrable. In late September, the Allies launched a massive coordinated assault on the Hindenburg Line itself. Australian, Canadian, British, French and American troops attacked with incredible determination. After days of brutal fighting, they broke through this final, powerful line of German defense. This was the point of no return. The German army was now in a state of near constant retreat, its will to fight broken. The 100 Days Offensive was a masterpiece of Allied operational planning and execution. It relentlessly hammered the German army, giving it no time to rest or regroup, and ultimately led to its complete collapse, forcing the German government to seek an end to the fighting. While the German army was being relentlessly pushed back on the Western Front, its allies, the other Central Powers, were collapsing one by one. The strain of 4 long years of war had proven too much for these old, multi-ethnic empires to bear. The first to fall was Bulgaria. After achieving initial successes against Serbia, the Bulgarian army had been locked in a stalemate on the Macedonian front, also known as the Salonika Front, against a multinational Allied force. By September 1918, the Bulgarian soldiers were exhausted, poorly supplied, and demoralized. A major Allied offensive, led by French and Serbian forces, shattered their lines. The Bulgarian army disintegrated, and on September 29, 1918, Bulgaria signed an armistice, becoming the first of the Central Powers to leave the war. Next to crumble was the vast Ottoman Empire. For centuries, it had been known as the sick man of Europe, and the war had accelerated its decline. The Ottomans had fought on multiple fronts, from the Caucasus against Russia to Mesopotamia and Palestine against the British Empire. By 1918, their forces were stretched to the breaking point. In the Middle East, a decisive British and Commonwealth offensive in Palestine, culminating in the Battle of Megiddo in September, destroyed the Ottoman armies there. Led by figures like T.E. Lawrence, also called Lawrence of Arabia, Arab forces rose in revolt against their Ottoman rulers. Facing total military collapse and internal rebellion, the Ottoman government sued for peace, signing the Armistice of Mudros on October 30, 1918. The most significant collapse was that of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany's main ally. This sprawling empire was a patchwork of different nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, and many others, held together by the Habsburg monarchy. The war had inflamed nationalist sentiments, and by 1918, the empire was tearing itself apart from within. On the Italian front, the Austro-Hungarian army made one last-ditch effort at the Battle of the Piave River in June 1918, which ended in a disastrous failure. In late October, the Italians launched their own final offensive at Vittorio Veneto. The Austro-Hungarian army, plagued by desertions and mutinies as soldiers from different ethnic groups simply walked away, completely disintegrated. On November 3, 1918, Austria-Hungary signed an armistice, and the ancient Habsburg Empire effectively ceased to exist. With all of its allies gone, Germany stood alone. the situation at home was just as dire as it was on the battlefield. The Allied naval blockade had caused severe food and fuel shortages, leading to widespread hunger and suffering among the German population. The news of military defeats and the collapse of their allies shattered the last vestiges of public morale. In late October, sailors in the German high seas fleet at Kiel mutinied, refusing to go on a final suicidal mission against the British Royal Navy. This mutiny sparked a wave of uprisings and revolutions across Germany. Workers' and soldiers' councils were formed in major cities, and the authority of the government collapsed. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, was forced to abdicate and flee the country. Germany was on the brink of civil war, and its new leaders had no choice but to seek an immediate end to the fighting. With its armies in full retreat, its allies defeated, and its home front collapsing into revolution, the German government had no other option but to sue for peace. The new civilian government, led by Friedrich Ebert, sent a delegation to negotiate with the Allied Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch. The meeting was arranged to take place in a secret location, Foch's personal railway carriage, hidden in the forest of Compiègne in France. The atmosphere was not one of negotiation but of surrender. Foch, a man whose country had been devastated by 4 years of German occupation and brutal warfare, was in no mood for compromise. He presented the German delegation with the Allied terms for an armistice, a temporary cessation of hostilities while a formal peace treaty was prepared. The terms were harsh and designed to make it impossible for Germany to resume the fight. The Germans were required to withdraw their forces from all occupied territories in France, Belgium and Luxembourg within 2 weeks. They had to surrender a vast amount of military equipment, including thousands of heavy guns, machine guns and airplanes. The German Navy was to be interned, and the Allies would occupy German territory west of the Rhine River. The Germans protested that the terms were incredibly severe and could lead to starvation and chaos in Germany. But Foch was unyielding. The German delegation was given a stark choice: sign the armistice within 72 hours or face a full-scale invasion of their homeland. Faced with this ultimatum, the German delegates, after communicating with their government back in Berlin, were given the order to sign. In the early morning hours of November 11, 1918, in that solitary railway carriage, the armistice was signed. The agreement stipulated that all fighting on the Western Front would cease at 11 a.m. Paris time that day. The news spread rapidly across the front lines. The war, the Great War that had consumed the world for more than 4 years, was finally coming to an end. The order was passed down through the chains of command. Hostilities will cease at 1100 hours today, November 11th. It was a moment of profound relief, disbelief, and quiet reflection for the soldiers in the trenches. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns on the Western Front fell silent. The cacophony of artillery, machine guns and rifles that had been the constant soundtrack of life and death for 4 years was replaced by an eerie, unfamiliar quiet. Soldiers cautiously emerged from their trenches, some cheering, some weeping, some simply standing in stunned silence. In cities like London, Paris, and New York, joyful crowds poured into the streets to celebrate the end of the slaughter. However, the fighting did not stop everywhere at once, and tragically, more than 2,700 soldiers were killed on the final morning of the war, in battles that continued right up to the 11 a.m. deadline. The war was over, but the long and difficult task of making peace and rebuilding a shattered world had just begun. With the fighting over, the victorious Allied powers gathered in Paris in 1919 to decide the fate of the defeated nations and to shape the post-war world. The negotiations were dominated by the Big Four President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau of France, and Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Each leader came with a different agenda. Wilson, an idealist, wanted a peace without victory based on his 14 points, which included the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. Clemenceau, whose country had suffered immensely, wanted revenge and to ensure Germany could never threaten France again. Lloyd George sought a middle ground, wanting to punish Germany, but not so harshly that it would lead to future instability. The resulting agreement, the Treaty of Versailles, was primarily focused on Germany and was largely a product of compromise, particularly between the French desire for security and the American vision of a new world order. The treaty's terms were punitive. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for starting the war through the infamous War Guilt Clause, Article 231. This clause became the moral justification for the other harsh terms. Germany was stripped of all its overseas colonies and lost significant territory in Europe, including Alsace-Lorraine, which was returned to France. Its military was severely restricted. The army was limited to 100,000 men, and it was forbidden from having an air force, tanks, or submarines. Perhaps the most contentious part of the treaty was the demand for reparations. Germany was ordered to pay enormous sums of money to the Allied nations to compensate for the damage caused by the war. The final amount was set in 1921 at a staggering 132 billion gold marks, a sum that Germany's crippled economy could not possibly afford. These financial penalties, combined with the loss of industrial territory, were designed to keep Germany economically weak for a generation. The combination of the War Guilt Clause, territorial losses, military restrictions, and crippling reparations was seen by the German people as a profound national humiliation, or dictated peace, that had been forced upon them. The treaty was signed on June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the very same place where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871 after France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. The symbolism was intentional and deeply humiliating for Germany. While the treaty officially ended the war and attempted to create a lasting peace, many observers at the time were deeply concerned. They argued that its harsh and punitive nature would breed resentment and sow the seeds of future conflict, rather than foster reconciliation. As the French Marshal Ferdinand Foch prophetically remarked upon reading the treaty, "This is not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. His words would prove to be tragically accurate. The end of the First World War did not simply mean the end of fighting. It meant the end of the world as it had been known. The war redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East in a way that was more dramatic than any event since the Napoleonic Wars a century earlier. 4 great empires that had dominated the continent for centuries, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires, lay in ruins. In their place, a host of new nations emerged, born from the principle of national self-determination, a key idea championed by Woodrow Wilson. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania appeared on the map, fundamentally altering the political landscape of Europe. This redrawing of borders was a messy and often violent process. The new nations were created along ethnic and linguistic lines, but the populations of Central and Eastern Europe were so intermingled that it was impossible to create perfectly homogeneous states. Nearly every new country contained significant ethnic minorities, creating new sources of tension and conflict that would plague the continent for decades to come. In the Middle East, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire led not to independence for the Arab peoples who had fought alongside the Allies, but to their lands being carved up by Britain and France into mandates, a form of colonial control that created artificial borders and sowed the seeds of future instability in the region. The war also fundamentally changed the global balance of power. Europe, which had been the undisputed center of global finance and politics for centuries, was left exhausted, indebted, and traumatized. The United States, in contrast, emerged from the war as the world's leading economic power. It had transformed from a debtor nation into the world's primary creditor, and its industry had boomed while Europe's was destroyed. This shift marked the beginning of America's rise to global superpower status. At the same time, the war planted the seeds of decolonization. The spectacle of European powers slaughtering each other shattered the myth of their superiority, inspiring nationalist movements in colonies across Africa and Asia. Perhaps the most significant political legacy was the birth of new, radical ideologies. In Russia, the war led directly to the Bolshevik Revolution and the creation of the world's first communist state, the Soviet Union. This would set the stage for the ideological struggle of the Cold War. In Italy and Germany, the combination of national humiliation, economic hardship, and fear of communism created fertile ground for the rise of another new ideology, fascism. The bitterness and instability created by the war and its peace settlement paved the way for the rise of dictators like Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, who promised to restore national pride and overturn the post-war order, leading the world directly towards an even more devastating conflict just 2 decades later. Beyond the redrawn maps and the shattered empires, the most profound legacy of the First World War was its staggering human cost. The scale of the slaughter was unprecedented in human history. An estimated 10 million military personnel were killed, and another 20 million were wounded, many of them grievously. Entire generations of young men from countries like France, Germany, Britain, and Serbia were wiped out. In many villages, there were simply no young men left. This lost generation left a deep and lasting scar on the societies they came from. The loss was not just in numbers, but in the potential that was extinguished. The poets, scientists, leaders, and fathers who never came home. The war's destruction was not limited to the soldiers. It is estimated that nearly as many civilians died as a direct or indirect result of the conflict. They perished from starvation caused by blockades, from disease, from military occupation, and in genocides like the Armenian genocide perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire. The war was followed immediately by the devastating 1918 influenza pandemic, often called the Spanish flu, which was spread around the globe by the movement of troops. This pandemic killed at least 50 million people worldwide, far more than the war itself, and its deadly impact was worsened by the malnutrition and poor sanitation prevalent in the war-torn regions. For those who survived, the mental and emotional scars often ran as deep as the physical ones. Millions of men returned home from the trenches suffering from shell shock, what we would today recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. They were haunted by the horrors they had witnessed, plagued by nightmares, tremors, and severe anxiety. At the time, the condition was poorly understood and often dismissed as cowardice or a lack of moral fiber. These veterans and the families who cared for them bore the invisible wounds of the war for the rest of their lives. The conflict left a legacy of grief and trauma that echoed through families for generations. The First World War was a cataclysm that fundamentally changed humanity's perception of conflict. The romantic, heroic notions of warfare were shattered forever in the mud, gas, and industrial-scale slaughter of the trenches. It was the first truly modern total war, demonstrating the terrifying destructive capacity of industrial technology. It left behind a world that was more cynical, more violent, and deeply uncertain about the future. The immense sacrifice was supposed to make the world safe for democracy, and to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it created a legacy of bitterness and instability that would lead directly to an even greater catastrophe, proving that the Great War was not an end, but a tragic beginning.